There are no photographs of the first meeting, no newspaper articles, no official records in any county archive. In the summer of 1956, 10 families made a decision that would sustain them for 70 years, and almost nobody knew it happened. The land remembers what people forgot. 1,500 acres of red Oklahoma clay, stretching between two unnamed county roads, holding a story that never made headlines. For 7 decades, this forgotten corner of rural America fed 10 families through droughts, economic collapses, and the slow death of small farming across the nation. And it did so in almost perfect silence. This is the story of the Red Valley Cooperative, a place that survived by staying invisible. The dust storms of 1956 didn't care about privacy. They tore across western Oklahoma with the same brutal efficiency they had shown 20 years earlier, stripping topsoil, killing crops, and forcing families to make impossible choices. Most people remember the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Few remember that Oklahoma faced another one in the mid-1950s, quieter but just as devastating to those who lived through it. James Turner owned 200 acres on the western edge of what locals still called Red Valley, though there was no official valley and no town by that name. His grandfather had claimed the land in the 1890s. His father had survived the Depression here. By June of 1956, James was 42 years old, married to Margaret for 18 years, and watching his wheat fields turn to powder. Margaret kept a diary, but she wrote in it sparingly. Her entry for June 14, 1956, contains just 11 words. James says we might have to sell. Don't know where we'd go. They didn't sell. Instead, James did something that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. He rode his horse to 9 neighboring farms and made a proposal that sounded like madness. Combine everything. Pool the land, share the equipment, work as one operation, divide whatever came from it equally among all families. There were no lawyers involved, no government programs, no agricultural extension office consultation, just 10 men sitting in James Turner's barn on a Saturday evening in July, trying to figure out if they could survive together when they were clearly dying alone. The first man to agree was Samuel, who owned the smallest property, 80 acres that bordered James's land to the north. Samuel was 28, newly married, and drowning in debt from equipment he'd bought 2 years earlier when wheat prices were high. He had nothing to lose. The last man to agree was Robert McIntyre, who owned 300 acres and had the most to risk. He agreed on a Tuesday evening after his wife told him she was pregnant with their 4th child and asked him quietly if they would still have a farm when the baby was born. By August of 1956, the Red Valley Cooperative existed, not on paper, not in any legal sense, just in the shared understanding of 10 families who began farming as one. Nobody announced it. There was no celebration, no ribbon cutting, no photograph in the local newspaper. The families simply began working differently. They started combining their wheat harvest into one storage facility. They shared tractors and trucks. They planted their fields according to a plan worked out over coffee at James Turner's kitchen table rather than individual whims. And they split the proceeds evenly, regardless of whose land produced more. It was, by every conventional measure, communism on Oklahoma red clay, and nobody noticed because nobody was looking. The first year, 1956, was simply about survival. The drought continued through fall. The cooperative's first wheat harvest, such as it was, barely covered seed costs and loan payments. But it did cover them, which was more than most individual farms in the county could say. 3 neighboring farms went into foreclosure that winter. The 10 families of Red Valley Cooperative stayed afloat, invisible in their shared struggle. Margaret Turner's diary entry for December 31, 1956, is longer than usual. Made it through the year. Don't know how exactly. James says the other families are good people to work with. He's home more now that we share equipment. Saw Sarah McIntyre at church. She's showing. Hope they have enough when the baby comes. The baby came in February. Robert and Sarah McIntyre's fourth child was born in the same bedroom where Sarah's three other children had been born, delivered by the same midwife who had delivered most children in that part of the county for 30 years. The cooperative families brought food for 2 weeks after the birth, not because it was a cooperative policy, because that's what neighbors did. The cooperative had no formal structure, no president, no board of directors. Decisions were made by consensus at weekly meetings that rotated between houses. These weren't official gatherings, they were coffee conversations that happened to involve farm management. If someone had walked in on one of these meetings, they would have seen 10 men sitting around a table, talking about wheat and weather and equipment maintenance. They wouldn't have realized they were witnessing a radical experiment in collective agriculture. The secrecy wasn't intentional. It was simply that nobody talked about it outside the 10 families. In rural Oklahoma in the 1950s, you minded your own business, and you didn't broadcast your financial arrangements. The cooperative existed in the space between what was legal and what was documented. It worked because everyone agreed it should work, and because nobody felt the need to explain it to anyone else. By 1960, the cooperative had weathered 4 years and was showing something remarkable: stability. While individual farms around them continued to struggle with debt and unpredictable yields, the 10 families maintained consistent, if modest, income. The pooled resources meant they could absorb bad years without catastrophe. A drought hit one field less hard because they had 9 others. Equipment failure didn't paralyze anyone because the machinery was shared and maintained collectively. But stability doesn't make headlines. Success without drama doesn't attract attention. The Red Valley Cooperative continued its work in the same quiet way it had begun. James Turner turned 46 in 1960. His son, also named James, but called by his middle name, Thomas, was 17 and working full-time on the cooperative's land. Young Thomas had grown up in this system. To him, it wasn't radical or experimental. It was simply how farming worked. He didn't know yet that 99% of American farms didn't operate this way. The 1960s brought changes, though none of them involved abandoning the cooperative model. Mechanization accelerated. The families pooled money to buy a new combine in 1963, a purchase no single family could have afforded. The machine served all 1,500 acres, maintained by whoever had mechanical skill, used by whoever needed it when their fields were ready. Margaret Turner's diary from this period becomes more sporadic, but her entry from November 1963 captures something essential. President Kennedy was killed in Dallas. Everyone's talking about it, but the wheat still needs to be harvested. Thomas says we'll finish the South Fields this week. James says the equipment co-op in town asked how we managed to keep our machinery running so well. He didn't tell them we all chip in for maintenance. Some things aren't anyone's business but ours. The cooperative's invisibility was its protection. In a political climate where collective farming was associated with communism and un-American activity, the Red Valley families simply looked like neighbors helping neighbors, which in a sense they were. But they were also running a successful agricultural collective that contradicted everything the broader culture believed about individual enterprise and competition. Children grew up. The original 10 families began to include a second generation. Young Thomas Turner married in 1966. His wife, Elena, came from 3 counties away and was surprised by how the families worked together. "It's different here," she wrote to her sister. "Everyone shares more than I'm used to, but it works. Tom says it's always been this way." The 1970s tested the cooperative in new ways. Agricultural prices fluctuated wildly. Fuel costs skyrocketed. Inflation made planning difficult, but the cooperative's collective decision-making provided a buffer against panic. When wheat prices crashed in 1977, the families agreed to hold their harvest in storage rather than sell at a loss. They survived on savings and part-time work until prices recovered. Individual farmers across Oklahoma went bankrupt, doing exactly what the cooperative refused to do, selling in desperation. Still, nobody outside noticed what was happening on these 1,500 acres. The cooperative paid its taxes. The families attended church. Their children went to local schools. They looked like every other farming community in Oklahoma because, in most visible ways, they were. But then came 1982, and the cooperative faced its greatest test. The farm crisis of the 1980s destroyed rural America in ways that still echo today. Interest rates soared above 20%. Farm debt ballooned. Land values collapsed. Between 1981 and 1987, more than 500,000 American farmers lost their land. Auction signs appeared on properties that had been in families for generations. Suicide rates in farming communities spiked. It was an economic catastrophe that played out in thousands of small towns with almost no national attention. The Red Valley Cooperative should have been destroyed. Every economic indicator said it was impossible to survive. Debt loads that had seemed manageable at 8% interest became crushing at 21%. Equipment that needed replacement cost 3 times what it had cost a decade earlier. Crop prices fell while input costs soared. But the cooperative had something most farmers didn't: collective decision-making and shared burden. When one family's loan came due with impossible terms, all 10 families contributed to refinance it at a credit union 2 counties away that offered better rates. When they couldn't afford new equipment, they learned to repair old equipment beyond what manufacturers claimed was possible. When crop prices made wheat unprofitable, they collectively pivoted to hay and cattle, using land they controlled together rather than having to convince individual landowners to change course. Samuel, now in his 50s, became the cooperative's informal economic manager during this crisis. He had a gift for numbers and an ability to see 6 months ahead in terms of cash flow. His kitchen table became the site of late-night planning sessions, where the 10 families mapped out survival strategies that no agricultural textbook would have recommended, but which worked in practice because everyone committed to them. Margaret Turner's diary entry from March 1984 is stark. Samuel says we're going to make it. I want to believe him. James hasn't slept well in months. He sees the auction signs on other farms when we drive to town. We're lucky to have each other. Or maybe it's not luck. Maybe it's just the only way to survive this. They did survive it. By 1987, when the farm crisis finally eased, 3 of the 10 original families had retired and passed their land shares to their children. 7 of the original members remained active. The cooperative had not only survived the worst agricultural economic collapse since the Depression, but it had done so without losing a single acre. And still, almost nobody knew the cooperative existed. There were reasons for the continued invisibility. The families never sought publicity. They didn't apply for government programs that would have required explaining their structure. They operated legally as individual landowners who happened to coordinate closely, which wasn't technically against any law, but which might have raised questions if scrutinized. They simply kept working, kept sharing, kept surviving together in a way that the broader American agricultural system said was impossible. The 1990s brought a different kind of challenge: environmental consciousness and the organic farming movement. Young farmers across America were questioning chemical-intensive agriculture and looking for alternatives. The Red Valley Cooperative, without ever calling itself organic or sustainable, had been practicing elements of both for decades simply because collective management allowed for longer-term thinking. In 1994, Thomas Turner, now in his 50s and the de facto leader of the second generation, proposed converting the entire 1,500 acres to organic certification. It was a massive risk. Organic transition requires 3 years of chemical-free farming before certification, meaning 3 years of lower yields without price premiums. For an individual farmer, it could be catastrophic. For a cooperative pooling resources across 10 families, it was manageable. The families voted. It was the first time they had formally voted on anything in nearly 40 years. The decision was unanimous: transition to organic. Elena Turner's letters to her sister during this period reveal the cooperative's quiet confidence. Tom says we're going organic, all of us together. It'll be hard for a few years, but we've been through worse. I think we can do it. Everyone's committed. They completed organic certification in 1997. By 2000, the Red Valley Cooperative was producing certified organic wheat, hay, and cattle on 1,500 acres without anyone in the broader organic movement knowing it existed. They sold through conventional channels at conventional prices until 2003, when a buyer from an organic food company happened to test their wheat and discovered its certification. Suddenly, they had access to premium markets, but even then, they didn't advertise. They didn't brand themselves. They simply sold their organic crops to distributors who paid more, and they split the additional income among the families according to the same equal share system they had used since 1956. The new millennium brought new pressures. Agricultural consolidation accelerated. Corporate farms bought up small properties across Oklahoma. Developers eyed rural land for suburban expansion. The romantic vision of small family farms was dying, replaced by industrial agriculture and urban sprawl. The Red Valley Cooperative should have been vulnerable. 1,500 acres split among 10 families wasn't large enough to compete with corporate operations running tens of thousands of acres. But the cooperative had advantages that couldn't be measured in scale. No debt, because they had paid off their loans collectively over decades, established organic markets that paid premium prices, and a governance structure that prevented any single family from selling out to developers. By 2010, the cooperative was on its third generation in some families. Young people who had left for college and careers in cities began returning, drawn by the stability and quality of life that the cooperative provided. This wasn't romantic nostalgia for rural life. It was practical recognition that the cooperative model actually worked, providing consistent income and community in a way that isolated individual farming could not. But still, the story remained largely untold. The families didn't use social media. They didn't write articles or give interviews. They simply continued farming together, dividing income equally, making decisions collectively, and surviving in an agricultural landscape that said their model was impossible. In 2015, a graduate student from Oklahoma State University doing research on sustainable agriculture heard rumors about a cooperative farm in Red Valley. She drove out, asked questions, and was politely deflected. The families weren't hostile, just private. They didn't see why their farming arrangements would interest anyone. The student left, wrote a footnote in her thesis about anecdotal reports of informal agricultural cooperation, and moved on. The cooperative remained invisible. By 2020, the cooperative had survived 64 years. The original 10 families had become 10 family lineages, with great-grandchildren farming land their great-grandparents had combined during a dust storm in 1956. The model hadn't changed fundamentally. They still pooled resources, shared equipment, made decisions collectively, and divided income equally. But the world around them had changed dramatically. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed vulnerabilities in consolidated agricultural supply chains. Food insecurity became a mainstream concern. Interest in local, resilient food systems surged. And suddenly, the model the Red Valley Cooperative had been using for 6 decades looked less like an anachronism and more like a blueprint. Still, the families didn't seek attention. They had survived by staying quiet, and they saw no reason to change that approach. When a food journalist heard about them and requested an interview in 2021, they declined, not rudely. They simply said they preferred to keep their business private. Margaret Turner died in 2022 at the age of 88. Her diary, covering 66 years, was inherited by her granddaughter. Reading through it, the granddaughter found a record of cooperative farming that documented what economists and agricultural historians had largely missed: that collective farming could work in America, not through government mandate or utopian experiment, but through simple neighbor-to-neighbor cooperation sustained across generations. But the diary remained private. The family saw no reason to publish it. By 2025, the Red Valley Cooperative had sustained 10 families for 69 years. The land was still productive, still certified organic, still managed collectively. The fourth generation was active in day-to-day operations. The model that seemed impossible in 1956 had proven more durable than almost any individual farm around it. And it had done all of this while remaining almost completely unknown. There are lessons here about resilience, about cooperation, about the power of communities to create alternatives to dominant economic models. But the families of Red Valley Cooperative aren't interested in being lessons. They're interested in farming, in feeding their families, in maintaining land that has sustained them through droughts, economic collapses, and cultural changes that destroyed most of rural America. The invisibility that protected them for 7 decades is fading now. Property records are digitized. Satellite imagery shows land use patterns. Agricultural databases track organic certification. Someone paying attention could piece together that something unusual is happening on these 1,500 acres. But for 69 years, almost nobody paid attention. 10 families built something remarkable in plain sight, and the world looked right past it. This is the story of the Red Valley Cooperative, a forgotten land that fed 10 families without anyone noticing. It's a story about what's possible when people cooperate instead of compete, when they think in generations instead of quarters, when they value survival over recognition. It's also a story about what we miss when we only pay attention to what's loud, what's advertised, what demands to be seen. The land is still there between 2 unnamed county roads in western Oklahoma. 1,500 acres of red clay holding 70 years of quiet resilience. If you drive past, you won't see anything unusual. Just fields and equipment, farmhouses and barns, the ordinary landscape of rural America. But if you knew where to look, if you understood what you were seeing, you might recognize something extraordinary, proof that another way is possible, sustained not by ideology, but by the simple, determined cooperation of neighbors who decided, in the summer of 1956, to survive together. They're still surviving, still together, still invisible to most of the world, and maybe that's exactly how they want it.